John 6:37 through 44 is a key passage in the Calvinism-Arminianism debate. So that's the passage we're going to single out and focus on. And it reads as follows.
All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never drive away. For I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all that he has given me, but raise them up at the last day. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. At this the Jews began to grumble about him, because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. They said, Is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, I came down from heaven? Stop grumbling among yourselves, Jesus answered. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day.
Now, regarding J.R.'s contention that John chapter 6 teaches the doctrine of irresistible grace, where God lovingly yet powerfully ensures that his elect come to Christ for salvation, even though their unregenerate fallen wills are naturally adverse to the idea, Dave wrote,
Unconditional election and irresistible grace are found in this passage? The words unconditional and irresistible aren't even there, nor can they be found elsewhere in the Bible.
To which J.R. responded,
And Jehovah's Witnesses dismiss the Trinity because the term does not appear in the Bible. So what, Dave? The concept does. And this is the case with John 6 as well. All that the Father gives me will come to me. Those are Jesus' words. It's the Father's giving that results in the coming of those so given. The giving precedes and therefore determines the coming. Giving is a divine act, and since it precedes the very existence of those so given, it must be unconditional. Hence, as I noted, unconditional election. But beyond this, Jesus says that all that the Father gives him will come to him. Not some, not most, all. Such cannot be said in your synergistic system, where grace tries but fails to save at least some. What do you call the belief that God never fails to bring his elect people unto salvation, but they infallibly come in faith to Christ? It's called irresistible grace, Dave. When God raises the dead sinner to life, that newly regenerated believer clings in faith to Christ. So as you can see, you do not need to use the terms unconditional or irresistible to have those divine truths right there in the text. And no matter how much you dislike them, Dave, they're still there. As long as John 6:37 remains in the Bible, people will embrace the doctrines of grace.
The argument that John chapter 6 does not teach the 5 doctrines of grace, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the perseverance of the saints, is based entirely on trying to build the case that the people being talked about in verse 40, which reads,
For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day,
are different from the people being discussed in verse 44, which reads,
No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day.
So to a large degree, the key to Dave's argument being correct in the Arminian position that John chapter 6 is not teaching irresistible grace and unconditional election is in making a distinction between those who the Father draws in verse 40 and those who Jesus will raise up at the last day in verse 44. In other words, in order for the Arminianist position to be correct, those two groups have to be two different groups. As Dave wrote,
Surely the words in John 6:40, 44, and 54 that state, quote, "I will raise him up at the last day," end quote, must refer to those who actually come to Christ, but not to all who are, quote, "drawn," end quote. It would certainly not include those who are drawn and then, quote, "draw back into perdition," end quote, Hebrews 10:39. The Calvinist is reading into Christ's words more than he actually says.
But is that true? One good man says yes. Another good man says no. So how can we tell? Here's how. In a wonderfully confirming way, a genuine, honest appeal to the Greek grammar can completely and definitively decide the case. As J.R. writes,
I do not argue as you do, Dave. When I say those who are drawn are the same ones who are raised up, I provide exegetical basis. Here's a summary. Number 1. In John 6:44, which is the key passage regarding drawing, we read,
No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day.
This is a single sentence. In Greek, we have helkuse, aton, kago, anastaso, aton, ente, eskate, hemera. The direct object of the action of the Father's drawing is the first aton, him. A grand total of 2 words separate the first him from the second appearance of the same term, and I will raise him up on the last day. Now you are telling us that this is a different him, a different group of people, that in fact there are many, many who are drawn who will not be raised up. You are telling us that the Father draws millions to Christ, but they do not experience the last phrase of this single sentence. And upon what basis? You don't tell us. Surely you can do so. What is the basis, Dave? The fact is, there is no reason to insert a disjunction between the direct object of helkuse and the direct object of anastaso. In fact, when we consider the syntax of the passage, we note that while helkuse is found in a subjunctive clause, the main tense comes from oudais dunatai elphin. No one is able to come. Note that the verb in the last clause is a future, and I will raise him up. The progression naturally flows into the last clause without interruption. That is, there is nothing indicated in the verbal structure to make kai disjunctive in any way. Something you would need to find to be able to substantiate your assertion. But instead, the Greek grammar makes it beyond dispute. The natural reading is to see aton, him, in both clauses as synonymous, in extent and meaning.
now, the explanation of John chapter 6 that I just described is essentially the argument that J.R. gave in the midst of his public debate with Dave. And I presented it in greater length and detail, not because I favor J.R., since I've never met him, nor did I pick it because I necessarily agree with his bottom line conclusion, although I do. Now, I presented that position because it appeals to a direct, intangible fact, a fact that can be verified and confirmed as accurate, versus a personal opinion and rhetoric, which is unverifiable and completely subjective. So while it is possible, when responding to J.R.'s arguments about the doctrine of irresistible grace, to randomly make impressive sounding statements like this,
God, who is love, does not love everyone, does not want everyone in heaven, has predestined to eternal suffering the unsaved, who clearly number in the billions, and even takes pleasure in damning them.
it is not possible to disprove statements like this.
In Greek, we have helkuse, aton, kago, anastaso, aton, ente, eskate, hemera. The direct object of the action of the Father's drawing is the first aton, him.